Okay, we're now recording, and we're up to chapter 8, From Saints to Sellers. Thank you for your patience.
And we started with Lenore, we just have been giving our perspective of the chapter and an explanation, trying to sharing to others how we understood it. But what might be helpful is that if you can give the overall arc or argument of the chapter and then kind of dig into how he makes that argument, that would be helpful. But if not,
I'll try to do what you're asking. To me, the overall argument of this chapter was about how Christianity over the course of history had a lot of rebellions, and the rebellions were based on ideologies and class privilege, and that people used the scriptures of Christianity as a way of justifying their basically communistic impulses towards sharing, and that.
I'm going to interrupt you for a moment. Is to somebody playing music in their room?
I need to get that off of there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. So there were some really, had some really amazing quotes, as usual. Okay, here's one. Communal sharing, communism, is one of the most outstanding features. According to Acts, and that's in the Bible, if you don't know. That's
what
on
page is this, Ken?
275. All that believed were together and had all things in common, and they sold their possessions and goods and parted them all according as every man had need. And, to each his need is a very big tenet of communism and Marxism. And as if to reinforce this view of Christian life, the gospel intones, and the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and one soul. Not one of them said that of all the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. And Bookchin says, if we take this description of early Christian community literally, and there's no reason that we shouldn't, the first believers practiced not merely communism, but usufruct. And then later on in the page, there's a talk about one of the many times that there was this breakout into communalism in Christianity, and they say all things are common among us, but our wives, which shows the sexism and the boundary there.
So that means they had several wives.
Right, I guess. Well, it means that, they might share their food, but they're not going to, share each other sexually. That's what I assumed. That's what it meant.
And also that it was speaking just to men about the freedom of men.
Exactly. It was speaking just to men. The sexism and patriarchy was fully in place there. Yes. another, okay, further on at the end of the chapter, there were some really amazing things that he said, which kind of changed my opinion of Bookchin. Well, he seemed to be preoccupied with sex in some things, and there were several of these rebellions where they did practice a lot of sex. He calls it mystically colored eroticism. He said, indeed, one of the surest marks of the subtle in spirit was precisely the ability to indulge in promiscuity without fear of God or qualms of conscience.
So was he relating to that as having to do with, no, we're not in freedom here?
Yeah, it has to do with freedom.
Okay.
Here's a kind of an overview, if I can find this quote, of the of how he sees these these Christian gospels of moving away from the Old Testament, where the value was getting justice, and the New Testament, the Christians being a move towards freedom. Oh, let's see. Okay, the covenant of justice, the Old Testament law. This is on page 274, last bottom paragraph, the bottom sentence. The covenant of justice, Old Testament law, was transmuted into the covenant of freedom as practiced by the early Christian congregations that apparently existed in ancient Judea before the fall of Jerusalem. And then the overall, he also goes into groups that flagellated themselves, and that was their covenant, that they beat themselves with rushes and other things. But here's what changed my opinion of Bookchin a bit, was that he said that we today can't forget that that we need to recognize the enormous importance of the ethical sphere for people of the Middle Ages, and that people today tend to look down on the people of the Middle Ages as if they were, but he doesn't. Should I read a paragraph about that?
If you feel it would be elucidative. I mean, so what, I'm curious how that changed your opinion of him, of Bookchin,
Well,
his opinion.
I had an opinion that Bookchin was kind of an arrogant atheist, but he has a lot of respect for the ethicality of middle-aged Christians. So okay. That's what changed for me. Mm-hmm. Thank you for drawing that out.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay, and here's one of the essences of it that I will read. It is on page 298.
And
was capitalism a more sophisticated?
Slowly. So.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you. Was capitalism a more sophisticated substitute for medieval society? To say yes would be arrogant presumption. To say yes would be arrogant presumption and an insult to the highly complex civilizations, both past and present, that have resisted modernization. That's in quotes. To emphasize the preeminence of contemporary society and history is subtly to elevate a deadening, homogenizing mass media over the spiritual yearning elicited by religious ceremonies, a mechanistic scientism over a colorful mythopoetic sensibility, and an icy indifference to the fate of one's immediate neighbors over a richly intertwined system of mutual aid. That's he makes his point much better than I was to himself there.
Yeah, that seems to sum up a lot. Do you think?
And then there's some really I mean, I kind of fell in love with Book Chin again by reading this for this some of these things. So for a while, last few classes, I was just going like, okay, will you know get to something that I like again? But and some of these things did this.
Ken, does from the title of the chapter, I would I have an assumption that he's talking about the thrust of historically of like elevating qualities that would be saintly qualities into the elevation of an economic and profit driven model. Am I making that up, or was that
No,
part of
you're
it?
absolutely not. And I mean, in my own life this week, I had a young woman talk about come over and talk about working at a restaurant where everyone in the restaurant is Christian, and they're Christian because they suffer. That the feeling of suffering, working so hard that you suffer, is the Christian attitude, and that's the attitude of the owners. And she doesn't want to put up with it anymore, of course. And it reminds me of the Max Weber's Protestant ethic in the spirit of capitalism, which is, I think, a lot of what this chapter is about. Is the
I was thinking the same thing. Yeah.
The focus on, you know, hard work towards. And a lot of what Bookchin pointed out is these other Christian sects that chose other parts of the Bible and other parts of the Christian Gospels to focus on, and rebelled against some of that. So yeah, so you were thinking about Max Weber as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Can I read a couple more things that are just, I think, like beautiful quotes? And these are on page, if you're going to read one page from this whole chapter, it would be page 300, the second to the last page.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, every appeal of human consciousness, be it, quote, class consciousness or, quote, personal consciousness, and there he kind of ties in our generation, Maxine, you know, where we've been, you know, going for our personal consciousness, is an appeal to the creativity of mind and an expression of belief in human virtue. I love that. And he goes, Marx, the, quote, materialist, Hegel, the, quote, idealist, Kropotkin, the, quote, ecologist, and Fourier, the, quote, utopian, have all embarked on the same voyage of hope, a belief in the powers of human reason to attain a free society. None has had a court of appeal more supreme than the sovereignty of thought and insight. The material dispensation that capitalism has created for the future is itself a, quote, freedom, unquote, one that has arisen, ironically, from the very context of bourgeois social relations. It is a freedom not merely to choose the kinds of goods society should produce, in parentheses, the freedom of productivist utopia, but to choose from among the extravagant, often irrational array of needs that capitalism has created, the freedom of a consumerist utopia. When these two freedoms are melded into a still higher one, the utopian dream that lies ahead can neither strictly productivist nor consumerist. In light of the freedom to choose products and needs, both as producer and consumer, one can envision a higher ideal of freedom, one that removes the taint of economism and restores the ethical basis of past times that is infused with the options opened by technical achievements. Potentially, at least, we are faced with the broadest conception of freedom known thus far. And he has this in italics, the autonomous individual's freedom to shape material life in a form that is neither ascetic nor hedonistic, but a blend of the best in both, one that is ecological, rational, and artistic. And just to give my summary to that in one sentence, I feel like the new values will put economy as a subset of ecology.
Well put.
So I fell in love with Book Chin again after reading this chapter, especially that last page. So that's my
wonderful page.
Yeah, great. I can see the thread now. This is interesting, hearing each one of you summarize that chapter, because I can see the thread that's linking to where this chapter that I read, for sure. Helpful. Sometimes when you're reading this stuff, it's so dense that we get stuck in the detail, but it's the overarching, the arc where, in a sense, once we can like manage the details, the arc is what's the most important thing. It's like a eagle's eye view on what he's saying and the threads that are being woven in this work, from my perspective, that I'm getting a lot of benefit out of. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So anybody else have like making connections before we move on?
I'm looking forward to hearing about 2 images of technology.
So yeah, who covered 2 images of technology? That must be Mario.
Mario, yes. This is, I will make a relatively brief summary based on my limited understanding of the chapter, because there are many things that obviously I don't understand. He starts by talking about the promises of technology and then the subsequent disenchantment. That means from being totally shocked that our creation is now turning against us. I mean, our creation, our promise, that's the first part of the 20th century. He talks, everybody was fascinated with the human achievements, and technology created a great hope. And I think it still does, but he sort of separates the 20th century in the first part, where everybody was fascinated, even, he says, during the first war, the First World War, until the Second War, where the terrible devastation of the war, the tens of millions of people dead, hundreds of thousands by the use of atomic bombs, and the threat of nuclear power coming to destroy all of us. So it was like the other face of technology. On the one side, the hope that we will have a utopian society where everybody will have access to a good life, meaning of a good life as technology sophistication, people that were able to extract all the benefits of technology through that equates having a good life, which is what we enjoy today. We think that we are having a good life because we can talk over the internet and have these video conferences and instantly communicate. I think what we are seeing today, it was impossible to imagine in his time, even 20 years ago. I think very few people were able to see the kind of amazing technology that we are seeing today in terms of the internet, robotics, energy production, many, many different things. Anyway, so he presents these two phases, like the promise and the disenchantment. He talks about the Greeks, what the difference between techne, he uses the word techne, meant to the Greeks, that there was and the word techniques that means to us, where for us means the usufruct of all these properties, all these things that we get from technology. And for the Greeks, it was more an artistic combination of using tools to produce works of art and people enjoying them. And that was the techne. It was a more human connection. So he presents those two phases also, the human, the Greeks using the techne to enjoy beautiful architecture, works of art, and we using techniques just to, in a very mechanistic way and not connected to our humanity. Then he enters into a discussion about labor and the meaning of labor. He also brings the Greeks again, Aristotle, the difference between a master worker and a simple manual worker. The master worker was the one that understood, had a vision, had the imagination, had the talent to connect to the work that he was doing. And a simple manual labor was somebody that was very mechanistically, cutting a piece of stone without having any idea of what was inside the stone, whereas the master worker was already thinking, in discovering this fantastic piece of art that will be discovered inside the stone. Mm-hmm. So there was this Aristotle mention of insights into an ethical responsibility into labor, into work. He also mentions in this same regard, ivory carvers in the organic cultures that were just, that had to have a connection to what they were doing in terms of finding the properties of the material. He talks about the grain. They had to find the grain to actually carve in a certain way that would produce an amazing piece of art rather than a mechanically polished or carved thing. So in general, he's talking about technology or labor with a human connection, with a soul, that we can say, and a very mechanistic and approach to labor and the satisfying just some needs, immediate needs of us, without a more broad sense of what we are producing, more bigger meaning of why and how. He talks a lot of that. Why and how are we doing what we are doing? Then he goes into criticism of science, and how science, he equates science as a very, again, mechanistic approach to understanding the world. And I wrote one of the sentences he used. He says, "Science, a temple built on the foundation of seemingly," I don't quite understand this, but I'm reading it, so maybe you can help me.
What page are you on?
I don't, I have the PDF version, so my pages are totally different, and I am reading from my notes. I'm not reading from the pages, so I'm sorry, I don't have a page.
It's okay.
A temple built.
It says, "Science, a temple built on the foundation of seemingly animistic and metaphysical ruins, without which he would sink into the watery morass of its own contradictions."
Ooh. Whoa. People don't usually talk about science like that.
Yes. Okay.
So a temple built on the foundation of a seemingly animistic and mechanistic,
Metaphysical.
metaphysical
ruins,
without
which it would sink into the watery morass of its own contradictions. Okay. So my understanding, as somebody that tried to be a scientist decades ago, is that he is trying to say that science also makes a lot of assumptions, and we can never reach the bottom, because every time we go deeper and deeper, we still have to make assumptions about some fundamental property of the universe, and it becomes like a religion. You know, when you look at all the amazing discoveries we have done in cosmology and in the realm of particle physics, you know, going from the extreme large vision of the universe to the extreme small, there are always some things that we have to come up with something like dark matter and dark energy that nobody knows what it is, and everybody knows or assumes that 95% of the universe is something we don't know. So we're basing all our assumptions on the physics of the universe on 5%. That's all we can, all what we can see with our instruments, with our and the fact that we use all these mathematical models, which mathematics, in my view, is a human invention. Why does mathematics have to reflect the reality? I mean, it's a tool, it's something we invented to count and, you know, make resolve problems. But anyway, that's my take. So in the end, he says, so my take is that he criticizes science in that, that's my humble understanding of what he's trying to say, in a very difficult language as usual.
Right.
That really touches on that prime argument between science and scientism, where like
yes.
Science is a tool and scientism is treating that tool as a religion and not looking at the core assumptions that we're making that are no different than faith.
Yes.
We have.
And these assumptions have changed during the 300 years. If we go from modern science, and we think that modern science started with Newton in the 1650s, you know, we have less than 400 years of modern science, and during those times, there have been many changes in the fundamental assumptions. Mm-hmm. So he ends the chapter saying, before we fully developed the machine, we began to organize our sensibilities, relationships, values, and goals around a cosmic enterprise to mechanize the world. So this cosmic enterprise to mechanize the world. So he's always, referring to the mechanistic view of, without a human connection, human touch. What we forget in the process is that we too occupy the very world we have sought to mechanize.
That's a great.
Awesome.
That's how we end.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's a really great lead into the chapter I covered.
Okay.
I'm gonna just jump right in. I really love PowerPoints, and so this time we were each doing a chapter instead of all talking about a chapter that we made.
You are a technic.
I made one, so share my screen. Pull that up.
And this chapter is the social matrix of technology.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, can y'all see this?
Yes,
Yeah.
very well.
So yeah, it was the social matrix of technology. The argument that he's making throughout the chapter is that the level of technology does not determine the level of social organization, but rather that the social organization itself is the most important technology. So he's going to be not just bringing up that distinction, but saying that there's lots of societies that had totally different social organizations, but the same kind of technology. And so that one doesn't necessarily mean the other. And then further, he's arguing that what's most important is the social organization of the society itself and how they integrate the technology.
For just a moment, how would the pictures of all of us are sort of blocking the screen?
Yeah, so you can above the top head, there's like different options. So you can make it so that just one person, so that there's 4 people. And then you can move that little window around.
And you can minimize it. And it may not be at the top, it may be at the left or the right, that black bar with some options on it, little icon.
There's one that says swap shared screen with video.
No, if you look at the dash, that will minimize the pictures so you can just see what's on the screen.
Okay.
Yeah, you could also make it smaller or bigger with in the corner, and
it's gone. Pictures.
Right.
But
okay. When I stop sharing, it'll come back up.
Okay.
And so, so that's the overall. Let me make sure I didn't slip this. Switch aside. Oh no. Okay, so in the beginning of the chapter, he looks at artisanship as like a primary example of the way that, kind of similarly to the way that Mario is describing the 2 different images of technology, one being this very like Aristotle's techne, this kind of like artful expression of the object itself, and the human just trying to like make that come out, versus a machine that then totally rules out the human expression of just humanness, and it's very mechanistic. And so I really appreciated this quote on page 332 where he says, "The exquisitely designed pottery of a vanishing artisan world, the beautifully crafted furnishings, the colorful and subtly intricate patterns of textiles, the carefully wrought ornaments, the beautifully sculpted tools and weapons, all attest to the wealth of skills, the care for products, the desire for self-expression, and to a creative concern for detail and uniqueness that has faded almost completely from the productive activity of our day." And so he is using this as an example and brings up the Eskimo society in particular to show that how we relate to technology as through through a relation of artisanship and care is a consequence of a relation of care towards each other. And so this way that we view technology emerges from the social organization of the group. And so he's arguing that in Eskimo society, they had a strong mutualistic care for each other, and that was also seen in the way that they made and sold objects. Mm. And so then he starts to bring up a distinction between libertarian and authoritarian techniques as a way to kind of show that not all techniques are the same, not all technology is the same and produces the same kind of social organization, because there's technology in both an authoritarian sense and a libertarian sense. So
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I have sort of started to transpose the word technology over his use of the word technics. Is that
right.
proper?
So I was doing the same thing, and he sometimes uses it interchangeably in the chapter, but I tried to do some Googling, and I tried to go back to a previous chapter, because he also uses the word techne and contrasts it with technics. And from what I can gather, I think that he is using it interchangeably, but maybe using it in terms of a more active sense, where technology is the noun and techniques are the way that we relate to technology, or the techniques that we use in implementing technology. Mm. So I think that it's a subtle difference, but not
okay,
strong.
Thank you.
Yeah. So where he says that the difference between the two is that authoritarian techniques produce institutional techniques. So from the technology itself, there's then the priestly corporations, emerging bureaucracies, later the monarchies and military forces, and then and also the very belief systems that validate this entire hierarchical structure. And what he's trying to argue is that it's not that the lavish material surpluses came out of these hierarchies and ruling classes, produced the hierarchies and ruling classes, but rather the hierarchies and ruling classes produced surpluses out of that, the way that they related to technology. Another distinction that he makes is between adaptive and innovative, where in pre-industrial societies, their relationship to technology was much more adaptive, whereas in industrial technologies, it's innovative, it's developing things for the sake of developing them, rather than trying to adapt what we have and adapt to our actual circumstances. So he says, where a culture is rich in social structure, where it enjoys a wealth of human relationships, communal responsibilities, and a shared body of mutual concerns, it tends to elaborate a new technical ensemble rather than develop it. Hello, what was that? I can't see you. I don't know where that sound came from. Okay, I'll just keep going. And then he gives the example of Asian villages, which not only resisted technical invasions, or they assimilated them into their form. So they maintained a strong sense of mutual responsibility and communal stewardship with the new kind of technologies. And then he brings up a distinction between the Iroquois and the Inca as a way to prove this argument, is that the social organization does not correspond with technological innovation, because he says that both the Iroquois and the Inca had identical technology toolkits in terms of their agricultural advancements, and that they were similar on the community level. But in terms of their political distinctions, the Iroquois were a democratic federation of 5 woodland tribes, and they had communal management of resources and production at the clan level, whereas the Inca were a highly despotic, centralized empire of mountain chiefdoms, and the resources were state-owned. The empire's, he said produce, but I think he means production, was confiscate. Their mode of production was confiscation of food and textiles and redistribution. So just highly centralized, even though they had the same technology. And so he's trying to argue that the technology takes form, the consequences of the technology takes form as part of a larger social matrix.
The technology, could you say that again, please?
Yeah, the technology takes form within the context of a social matrix. So instead of the other way around, where the social matrix influences the the technology is embedded in a social system, which is more primary. So like the Iroquois had a particular social system, the Inca had a particular social system, and due to that social system, the technology had different consequences. For the Inca, that was centralized and very very dictatorship. They centralized all the resources and distributed it and had like large surpluses, whereas the Iroquois managed resources on a much smaller level.
Yeah, but that is the distribution. He's also saying that the technology was the same.
Right.
They had a similar level of technological development.
Right.
So on the one side, he's saying, okay, the social structure can have an influence on how the production, the goods are distributed. But on the other hand, it may not have a big influence in how technology is developed. Is that correct?
I think that he does. So like the previous slide where it was developed differently in terms of whether something was adaptive or innovative, I think he is trying to make a distinction between what he calls pre-industrial and post-industrial societies. But I think in this case, he's not so much trying to make the distinction of like how technology changes over time, but rather that technology could be the same and the stewardship of the resources, the modes of production, the modes of distribution could be fundamentally different based on the social organization. So he's just trying to make an account of why that's more important without, in this case, trying to say how that affects the technology itself.
What I'm seeing is that it's the values of the society that direct the organization of the politics.
Well, the values
and governance,
Yeah, I think that they're deeply intermixed. Like the values and the organization are kind of like hard to take apart.
The point you made before, the one that you have up here about the Asian societies, and piggybacking on what Maxine said in comment to you, when I got a tour of the Klongs in Bangkok, our tour guide said, and Thailand is a society that's 5,000 years old and at least, and was never conquered by, never colonized. They said that, and it's first world. It's really first world. But what I can see as far as technological development and wealth. Tuan, our boat person that was taking us around, said that what happens in the Klongs is if somebody gets wealthy, in contradistinction to what here, that they might build a slightly bigger house and renovate their house, but the social context there is that they are responsible for having parties and paying for them for the neighborhood, and inviting people and taking care of things. They're important, unlike in our social society where, somebody gets wealthy, they move to a lock-gated community with other recently wealthy people. And it just seems so wholesome in comparison. And that prove that, that's like an example of Bookchin's point about how the social structure determines what happens with the technology.
Right, and this kind of, it also relates to Maxime's points about the values being most fundamental, because I think that this might be the week that you missed, that second week, but that's something that he covered in that chapter, something very similar to your point about Thailand, about it was inappropriate for someone to have an extreme surplus of wealth, like because of this importance of usufruct, of that things need to be used, and there needs to like this feeling of egalitarianism. That in a lot of pre-industrial or pre-literate societies, they didn't store or hoard wealth. It was like they would do what they needed to do and then use it to share or celebrate with others. Let's see. So now he's trying to give like a kind of historical trajectory of the moment in which technics surpassed the local context, and then almost what became so the social matrix and the local context was a limiting thing. So it limited the advance of technology. And then there came a point where it was inverted, and technology became something that grew on its own with no limits and only market direction. And so he says, for centuries, techniques have been embedded in and constrained by the social matrix. And the quote is, techniques in itself tended to follow an age-old tradition of nestling closely into a local ecosystem, of adapting itself sensitively to local resources and their unique capacity to sustain life. And it was only modern capitalism that could seriously subvert this ancient sensibility and system of technical integration. And so he's making this point not just in terms of the resources that are limiting, but also the knowledge of the landscape. There's this really great quote that I didn't include here on 347 that says that's just talking about like accordingly techniques function as a highly specific catalyst between the people of an area and their environment. The rich knowledge of habitat, of a region, of local flora and fauna, of social conditions, even geology, that enabled people like the Bushmen or the Sand to provision themselves in what seemed to Victorian Europe as an utter desert wasteland, survived well beyond primordial times and into the European Middle Ages. And so it's like this internal wealth of a natural habitat and the knowledge that's been lost to modern humanity. This is the key part. Kept the latent exploitive powers of technic well within the institutional, moral, and mutualistic boundaries of the local community. I kind of wish I put that in this slide. But he's really trying to drive home that this is when technics moved past the mutualistic and the value systems of the community itself and removed itself from the knowledge of the local landscape. And we see that now with globalized capitalism. And then this, he kind of makes this point tangentially. I didn't quite see how it relates to the larger things, but it kind of relates to Mario's chapter, that there was also this jump from seeing freedom from labor or freedom from activity and not freedom for activity or creativity. He says one was not merely free in the passive sense of freedom from constraint, but in the active sense of freeing both oneself and one's fellow citizens. So kind of seeing like how technology relates to being able to free us up in terms of our time rather than being free from the constraints of something. And we could see this now in terms of the way that we understand automation and AI. And we see them as like this scary thing that'll make it so that we lose our jobs. But that's again only because the system is set up in a way where there's a select few that own the machines and they're the only ones that will reap the benefits of that. Whereas we could be viewing it as the automation and AI give us freedom for activities, freedom for pursuing our highest good, freedom for developing ourselves and our knowledge base.
I want to just make a little link. Can you go back to that for just a sec?
Sure. Sorry.
Yeah, freedom for versus freedom from. When I was learning a little bit about Rudolf Steiner, one of the things that was embedded in the education, in the Steiner education, Waldorf education, is the concept that freedom is based on responsibility. We tend to think of freedom as like, oh, I don't have to do this. I'm not stuck in that. But in fact, the deeper meaning of freedom, as Steiner defined it, was that in order to be free, we're engaged in being responsible to something.
I love that.
So that seems to be, to me, I'm seeing that within this concept.
Yeah. I can't remember if it was here that someone brought it up or somewhere else, and whether I even shared it yet, but I heard recently about how the Germanic roots of the word freedom are interconnectedness, that we were more free the more intimately related we were to the web.
Wow, that's a powerful paradigm shift, isn't it?
Yeah, I wish I could remember where I heard that from, but
we'll have to look that up.
Yeah. And so this is the last slide, which is his conclusion, basically, is how do we then move towards an ecological liberatory technique? And he seems to be really trying to make like a move backwards of like, you know, being like, this is how they used to do it. We should do it similarly, but with, you know, solar panels and things like that. And so he says an ecologically oriented technical imagination must seek to discover the way of things as ensembles, to sense the subjectivity of what we so icily call natural resources, and to respect the attunement that should exist between the human community and the ecosystem in which it's rooted. So this really sets us up for the future chapters. And he closes which is giving an image of what a more appropriate or liberatory technology would look like, which he says, the best designs of solar collectors, windmills, water mills, gardens, greenhouses, bioshelters, biological machines, tree culture, I don't know what he means by that, but solar villages, it will be little more than new designs rather than new meanings, however well-intentioned their designers. And he says that these things won't help us, these things won't be liberatory unless we fundamentally shift our relationship to each other and to the natural environment. So, and that's it. Okay.
Fantastic.
On the macro, that was beautiful. But one comment back before you stop your chapter, which is that on the macro scale, you're talking about the freeing of IT and our fears that it will just keep us from our jobs. Well, if we had the assurance of a guaranteed national income that some of the more advanced societies are considering around, Europe and New Zealand and so forth, then it would be liberating like that. There are these ideas out there on the globe, not in America where we're hunkered down into our capitalism and hierarchy. But,
yeah.
And I just applaud the way you presented your chapter. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I totally wish I would have done the same thing now, because it helps. What I found with the PowerPoints is that it can help organize one's thinking, or when we're inside the chapter, to make an outline like that. So
yeah, I want to make sure that Maxine has tons of time, but I want to bookmark a conversation for later about the dangers of universal basic income and how it makes us dependent on these corporations that own everything, and that an alternative is to socialize the ownership of the machines through which we're able to survive. And so it's a debate, like some people see one or the other. So I just want to, at some point we could talk about that.
Okay. I don't know that.
That would be great. Yeah, I never heard of that either. So
yeah, no, it's a great topic and we should embrace it. Thank you, Sophia.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. All right. So the ambiguities of freedom. Golly. Okay. So basically, Bookchin embraces this topic in the following way, that the freedom that technological developments were expected to yield, the material abundance and plenty, and basically the elimination of debasing toil, and the triumph of the human mind and science of the Enlightenment, which was also supposed to contribute to freedom, has not necessarily panned out that way. And so he spends a lot of time in this chapter going over the ways in which technology and reason and science, these three areas, have contributed more to manipulation and domination rather than freedom. Giving history, of course, since the mid-20th century, where reason became rationalism with a cold logic for sophisticated manipulation of human beings and nature. Science became scientism, where an ideology for viewing the world as an ethically neutral mechanical body to be manipulated, and modern technology asserting authority of technology, of the technologically trained elite. So all three promised and now threaten freedom, according to Bookchin. So his idea is that we have to somehow rescue their liberatory promise. And he says that the need to rescue reason as an ethically charged logos, which is the word of God. So there it is, just like we talked about science being elevated to scientism, becomes like a religion. And reason also has been elevated to a religion, like it's taken the place of God for the modern world. Does not conflict with its use as a logic for dealing with that world. So he's not saying, let's throw out the baby with the bathwater in terms of reason or science or technology. Okay, so that's an important concept in this chapter. But he's asking for us to go deep, beneath the surface, to get at the roots of freedom, to sort and reveal the oppression lying dormant within the liberation thrust, to not gloss over an idealized method, which is science, tool, which is the techniques, and approach, which is reason, to do the shadow work, essentially. He doesn't use that terminology. Of course, shadow work comes out of Jung and the world of psychology. But what I was seeing in this chapter is an overlay of some of my own study. I feel like what he was getting at and grappling with were transpersonal issues. So whereas he's constantly referring back to, he doesn't seem to like the mythopoetic. Like he puts mythos and mysticism in a box that to me looks like he looks down upon it, much like the rational and scientific communities do. Like he falls into that. And yet what he begins to get at in this chapter is that there is a kind of intelligence to nature's evolution that we as humans and humanity is a part of and participatory in. So let's see. I'm going to tie some of this together a little bit. Yeah, so he says, the definition and use of reason, science, and techniques matter. It impacts our ability to resolve what he calls ambiguity, or we could also think of as paradox. So this resolution depends on a supreme act of human consciousness. Okay, so he's taking all this hard science and technology and he's bringing it back to, ultimately we have to have a consciousness that embraces a way to utilize all of this amazing resource that we have, not just natural resources, but the resource of intelligence and technology, right? And like that, and innovation, and put it to use in a way that, well, it's, as we've been seeing in the thrust of these chapters that you all have read and summarized for us, there's a thread, there's an arc that's happening. He says, so in order to surmount the evil that lies in every good, to redeem the gain inherent in every loss, such as ideals in a social conflict. So we're having a conflict, but we want to continue to hold the ideals as we explore the contradictions. Willfulness, the willfulness in patriarchy, the personality and individualism, to redeem these desiderata without completely shedding the features that give them viability. So such as solidarity, innocence, tradition, community, will, will all require the wisdom and artfulness that we possess. So he suggests that we need a new kind of imagination to transmute these often oppressive, archaic contexts. How I understand what he's saying in this chapter is we're up to integration at this point. Like, it's an evolutionary thrust that we have incredible amounts of information and ingenuity at our fingertips, and we need to somehow integrate it with that, maybe what, the old ways, like the old understandings, I should say, which incorporated like a sense of, in those traditional cultures, a sense of connection with the natural world rather than a sense that we're apart from or other than the natural world. To recognize that we are, in fact, part of the natural world, and to re-establish our experience of that in some way. The question that arises is, how can this be done? So he does a lot of analysis of the ambiguities of reason and logic, which are not as straightforward as we may have been led to believe, on the basis that reason is ostensibly objective, but I question that it can be. So there was a lot about subjectivity and objectivity in this chapter, and an elevation of objectivity, which we've seen in the modern age. How can we remove from our humanity? How can we do that? When we try to do that, we lose our humanity in the technique, as has just been described by in the last couple chapters. So reason has enhanced our technical powers to alter the world drastically without providing us with the goals and the values that give these powers direction and meaning. Freedom entails not only the social structure of freedom, but also the sufficiency in the means of life to practice freedom. And so he goes into the importance of practice, and something that's not just theoretical, but that we're actually employing in our day-to-day world. So let's see. So the precondition of freedom, he says, is domination for personal autonomy, and also domination of the internal and psychic nature by a rational apparatus of repression. So again, this is kind of like the downside and the of what we're struggling with. He loops around a lot. I felt like he was looping around a lot in his trying to understand and analyze subjective and objective thought, reason, and make sense of how the mind works and how we can possibly extricate ourselves from the traps of the rational mind and the ego that have created humanity as more important than any other aspect and apart from nature itself. And now I'm going to skip the rest of that conversation because, as I said, it was sort of looping and looping and looping and not getting anywhere. But ultimately, he started to pull back into instrumentalism, and I had to understand that. But that is more of the same, that the instrumentalism failed to live up to its historic claim of emancipating humanity, but it even failed to approximate its more traditional claim of oh yeah, that's the same thing. Let's see, I want to get to nature now. Okay, so basically then he gets to the fact that nature has to become once again a central operating feature of how we think and how we organize ourselves. That we've moved away from nature from that standpoint of humans need to dominate nature to survive. And so, but he says this requires careful qualification, because even Stalin basically projected on nature, if I understand this. And so it was very nature centered, and then still there was all this domination and heinous, inhumane organization and governance and tyranny. So in radical social ecology, he says radical social ecology is interpreted non-hierarchically in terms of unity and diversity and spontaneity as a constellation of ecosystems, a meaningful natural history, a developing creative and fecund nature that yields an increasing complexity of forms and interrelationships. And he gives the example of molecular interactivity, which includes neurological responses and an ineffable sensibility that occurs as a result of increasingly complex patterns of integration. And here, my understanding is he's really starting to talk about energy, this ineffable sensibility, a consciousness of connectivity. And that creates a growing purposeful activity of form, and where subjectivity is like the history of reason, a slowly forming mentality that exists on a wider terrain of reality than human cerebral activity.
Wow.
This stuff was really, it's very interesting to see how he talks about what I would consider consciousness studies, but from a scientist's view. And he says that nature basically, so I had to look up subjectivity, because he kept going over and over and over, and it was a little bit, like I said, I was getting looped. So I found that subjectivity expresses the substance at each level of its organization and in all its concrete forms, that actively functions to maintain its identity, equilibrium, and fecundity, and place within a constellation of phenomena. And basically what he's saying is that nature itself is subjective, that it's self-organizing, it's self-creating, and it exists beyond human involvement.
Beautiful.
So that phenomena play an active role in their own evolutionary processes.
That's
so
incredible.
It's incredible, right? It's really powerful. And so what this chapter essentially was getting at is what I've been very excited, the other book that I've been super excited about over the last same period of time, 3 or 4 years, is this. It's called Embracing Life Towards a Psychology of Interdependence. And this book Bookchin in this chapter was referring to some of the molecular biology that's in here that's also kind of substantive for transpersonal psychology and a new way of thinking that embraces that our strength, our resilience, our creativity, our fecundity is all based on how we connect, not how we separate. And in this case, Murray's saying how we connect with nature. Like, instead of putting personality types on nature, like nature's kind and gentle, or nature's brutal, we say nature is creative, nature is fecund, right? So, and we connect with that without putting on the humanistic kind of, without projecting on nature.
As best we can.
Right, as best we can. So he's placing the human mind within the larger natural evolutionary intelligence, an intelligence of nature, through his terminology of some subjectivity. And I'm saying this, I'm going to reaffirm that he isn't talking about God. He's not asserting a religion, okay? But he is speaking about there is an intelligence. There is an evolutionary self-creative thrust that we as humans are a part of. And that's exactly what this guy says in here.
It's important that we're a part of as opposed to being on top of, which is what
Correct.
we've had this arrogant attitude all along.
Or as a victim of
a victim of
random nature, random weather patterns even, you know, because beyond this climate change, which is now elevated weather to being something that humans have created. But before that, weather was still affecting humans. Mm-hmm. There was always flooding. It's in the Bible. It's in the Aztec histories, way back. Earthquakes and all of these things. So there is a thrust. How can we participate with it? And there was one thing in here also that I know we're getting to the end of our time, and I want to just make sure I don't leave any. Of course, he talked about Darwinian nature, Hellenic, animistic, Judeo-Christian, all of this was in there. And the question of how to avoid the perils of instrumentalism. He says it can't be done without recreating our existing sensibilities, technology, and communities along ecological lines. So his suggestion is that we have to create ourselves along with our ecology. And just to draw some threads, I see permaculture, the field of permaculture, as holding the intent to do just that. Let's look at nature, let's observe it throughout seasons, and let's look at the intelligence there and then mimic that in how we organize ourselves. So what he's talking about in here, we do have some models in the world for that are being explored today. Permaculture is one of these. Another is when he talks about a humanity that's sensitized to the creativity of nature. One way that humans do this is through ingestion of plant medicines, so that we change our consciousness by taking in these plants that literally open up parts of the brain that are separate in everyday activity, and we alter our consciousness. It separates these so that we can see the connection between differences. And this is also a way that humans have aligned themselves with nature and opened to the voice of nature, which he speaks of in this chapter. Kind of blew my mind. He said, yes, nature will speak to us. So the question is, how do we become receptive to that? And he doesn't, as I could read in this chapter, I have to read it again. I don't see that he has said how we do that, just that we must. So, but he does say in the germ of a plant, this was actually a quote from Paul Shepard, I think, that in the germ of a plant, the whole is brought forth, if not developed, is yet hidden and contained ideally within itself. In other words, in its ideal form, not ideally as in dreaming about it. So we have all that we need inherent. That's life, that's nature, that's what's the same between nature and us. We have all this perfect information embedded in our DNA, in our shared genetic matrix with all of nature. So it's kind of a hopeful, if not careful and qualitative assessment about the potential of freedom and our role in it.
Well said.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think that like that kind of how to do this is hopefully the next chapter. So, which is the last chapter. And so, but both the last chapter, the Ecological Society, and the epilogue together are about 60 pages.
Mm-hmm.
So, and so I would suggest pacing yourself. It looks like there's a lot of references to other things, but I'm hesitant to say skim because it's the last chapter, and hopefully he'll be laying out some more like instructional visions of what he is suggesting we create given this historical trajectory. And so I would suggest doing a close reading if you can, and just doing 10 pages a day.
I have a thought, actually, and that is that maybe we split ourselves up in two groups, and one would focus on the chapter and one on the epilogue, and then beyond that, read whatever we can. Maybe Sophie and I will try and do both, but maybe if you guys want to pick one that you'll focus on, and then to make sure that there's depth in both areas. What do you think about that?
It's hard to say because I haven't really looked to see what the content is.
I mean, ostensibly the epilogue is going to be a summation.
It doesn't look like it.
Oh, it doesn't? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I see that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure where he's going with the epilogue, but it doesn't, yeah.
Okay. Well, then let's just do our best.
One more session or two?
One.
Yeah, last week's.
This is our last one, yeah.
And I would like to just propose that anybody who is interested in taking this work further, continuing with some readings and exploration about how what we've read and what we might take forward connects with our work in the world, and how we might like to integrate some of this. I am open to a continuing and ongoing group.
That would be a very interesting discussion.
I would suggest, in terms of next week, just focusing on an ecological society, which is the last chapter, and trying to get through the first like 3 or 4 pages of the epilogue, and just doing the best you can with the rest of it, but really to focus on the chapter itself.
Great. Okay.
Thank you.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it seems like the first like 3 or 4 pages of the epilogue look really cool, and then the rest, I'm not sure where he was going with it because it looks super divergent. So we'll see. I'll try. Yeah.
Great.
Cool.
All right.
Well, I really loved everyone's presentations. I think this was a really great way to get through a lot of it. So I really appreciate all of you for really digging deep into it on your own.
Me
So
too.
before we close, can I make a stupid question? So the only things left are the last chapter and the epilogue. And
Yes.
we are supposed to read both for next week.
Yes, it's 60 pages total. I would focus on the last chapter over the epilogue.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Just making sure.
Yeah, no, appreciate you clarifying.
Just a brief connection with one of Maxine's last points. This has been a very influential book in my life in the past few years.
Yeah.
Plant Intelligence, and other things that Stephen Bonner has written in. It led a lot of different places for me.
Great. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I'm writing that down too.
And what was the other book you mentioned?
The other book is called Embracing Life Towards a Psychology of Interdependence. And I actually met the author. I participated in a couples community with him many, many years ago in the Bay Area. And he's a friend of mine. I now consider him a friend. He's really an amazing psychologist.
Is
Goff?
it Goff or Goff?
Goff. Yeah, David Lucky Goff. And he was influenced to write this particular book after having a near-death, an aneurysm, suffering an aneurysm where he nearly died, and was completely impacted his life moving forward. Affected his physical and brain function, and enabled him to make connections that he hadn't made before. So very, very interesting book. All right, everybody, have a great week.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Have a great week.